Tina Thomas stood by the window of her childhood home, gazing out at the serene Birmingham neighborhood that had always been her sanctuary. Today, it was alive with activity. Friends and family gathered to celebrate her wedding. She was glowing, her face lit with a smile that seemed almost too wide for her delicate features. Behind her, her father, Tommy Thomas, adjusted his tie nervously. "You sure about this, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice a blend of affection and unease. Tina turned, her soft curls bouncing as she laughed. "Dad, you're just nervous because I'm growing up." Her words didn't soothe him. Tommy had always been protective of his only daughter, and something about Gabe Watson, Tina's fiancé, didn't sit right with him. Gabe was charming, no doubt, handsome, confident, and endlessly polite. But Tommy had noticed small things: Gabe's tendency to dominate conversations, his subtle dismissals of Tina's opinions, and his insistent focus on building their future together. Still, Tommy pushed his doubts aside. Tina was happy, and that was all that mattered. As the ceremony began, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. Tina, radiant in her white gown, took Gabe's hand at the altar. His smile was practiced, almost rehearsed, but his grip on her hand was firm, too firm, Tommy thought. The vows were exchanged, promises of forever spoken with the ease of routine. When the priest declared them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause. Yet as Tommy clapped along, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. Something was off. Later at the reception, Gabe's charm was on full display. He worked the room effortlessly, shaking hands, cracking jokes, and thanking guests for their kind wishes. Meanwhile, Tina was swept up in the euphoria of the day, her laughter ringing like a melody. "She's so happy," Tommy muttered to his wife Cindy, who nodded in agreement. But even Cindy couldn't deny the flicker of unease in her husband's eyes. As the evening wore on, Gabe pulled Tina aside. "Hey, we should finalize the insurance paperwork tonight," he said, his tone casual but insistent. Tina hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Can it wait? It's our wedding day." Gabe's smile didn't falter, but his grip on her arm tightened. "It's just a formality, sweetheart. For us, for our future." Reluctantly, Tina nodded. She trusted him. Tommy watched this exchange from a distance, his protective instincts flaring. He approached them with a forced smile. "Everything okay here?" Gabe's charm snapped back into place like a mask. "Of course, Mr. Thomas, just talking about the honeymoon plans." But as Gabe led Tina away, Tommy's unease deepened. The night ended with sparklers and laughter as Tina and Gabe drove off to begin their new life together. Tommy stood at the edge of the driveway, watching the taillights disappear into the night. Cindy placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "She'll be fine, Tommy. She's with the man she loves." But Tommy couldn't shake the image of Gabe's calculating smile, the tension in his grip, the urgency in his voice. For everyone else, this was the start of a beautiful love story. For Tommy, it felt like the opening chapter of a mystery he couldn't yet understand. The plane descended into Cairns, the small Australian city glowing under the tropical sun. Tina leaned her head against the window, marveling at the emerald waters of the Great Barrier Reef. "It's breathtaking," she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and hesitation. Gabe glanced over from his seat, his tone light but firm. "It's even better when you're in it. You'll love diving, trust me." The first steps off the plane felt surreal. Tina had never traveled so far from home, and the warmth of the air carried a hint of adventure. Gabe's excitement was palpable. He moved quickly, handling their luggage and leading her to the waiting shuttle with a confidence that seemed to put her nerves on edge. "Just stick with me," he said, squeezing her hand. "I've got it all planned out." Their resort was the picture of luxury, a secluded paradise surrounded by lush greenery and endless blue waters. Tina felt a fleeting sense of relief as they checked in, the atmosphere calming her jitters. The concierge handed them a brochure about the upcoming dive. "Tomorrow is the Yongala dive," the man explained, his accent thick but warm. "It's challenging, but unforgettable." Gabe nodded enthusiastically while Tina hesitated, her stomach churning. At dinner that night, Tina voiced her concerns. "I don't know if I'm ready for such a deep dive, Gabe. I've barely practiced." Her voice wavered, a small crack in her confident demeanor. Gabe, however, dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "You've got me, remember? I've done dives like this dozens of times. Just follow my lead." The reassurance didn't sit well with her. Even as Gabe detailed the beauty of the Yongala wreck, Tina's thoughts lingered on the potential dangers. Her unease didn't go unnoticed by Matt, another diver seated at a nearby table. He approached them with a friendly smile, introducing himself as an instructor who'd been diving for years. "It's an incredible experience," he told Tina, "but it's not for everyone. You've got to be comfortable with your gear, with the depth." His words, though kind, deepened Tina's doubt. Gabe's demeanor shifted subtly. His charming smile tightened, his responses curt. "We're fine," he said, dismissing Matt's concerns. Tina felt the tension but chose to stay quiet, not wanting to escalate the situation. Yet as Matt walked away, she caught a glimpse of Gabe's expression, an unreadable mixture of annoyance and something darker. That night in their villa, Gabe's mood softened. He talked about the future, their plans, and how this dive was just the beginning of their shared adventures. "You've got to trust me, Tina. I wouldn't let anything happen to you." His words were soothing, but they didn't erase the unease that had taken root in her heart. The next morning arrived too quickly. As they boarded the dive boat, Tina's nerves were visible. Gabe remained upbeat, chatting with the crew and other divers, but his attention to Tina felt more calculated than caring. Matt was there too, offering a reassuring smile as Tina suited up. "You'll be okay," he said quietly, but as she glanced at Gabe, she wasn't so sure. The boat sped across the open waters, the reef looming closer. Tina tried to focus on the beauty around her, but every wave of excitement was tinged with dread. The weight of her gear felt heavier than it should have, and the pressure of Gabe's expectations pressed down on her shoulders. She wanted to trust him, needed to trust him, but something in her gut whispered otherwise. As the boat anchored at the dive site, Gabe adjusted her tank with practiced ease. "Relax," he said, his voice smooth. "I've got you." Tina nodded, forcing a smile, but the unease remained. As the other divers prepared to enter the water, Matt gave her a final look, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she considered stepping back, but Gabe's voice cut through her hesitation. "Let's do this." Tina took a deep breath and stepped off the boat. The water enveloped her, cool and heavy as the world above faded from view. Below her, the ocean stretched into the abyss, beautiful, mysterious, and unforgiving. The dive boat rocked gently in the open water, the engine hum blending with the rhythm of the waves. Tina adjusted her mask, her breath audible and uneven. The rest of the group moved with an ease she envied, chatting, checking their gear, laughing. Gabe stood near the edge of the boat, his stance casual, his eyes scanning the horizon. When he turned to her, his smile was confident, almost too confident. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice light but insistent. Tina hesitated, gripping the side of the boat. "I guess," she replied, her voice barely audible over the wind. Gabe leaned closer, his tone firm. "It's going to be fine, just stay close to me." His reassurance was meant to comfort, but it felt more like a command. Tina nodded, swallowing her doubts. This was their adventure after all. She didn't want to disappoint him. One by one, the divers entered the water, disappearing beneath the surface in graceful arcs. Tina's turn came. Gabe adjusted her tank straps, his hands deliberate and precise. "There," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "You're good to go." Matt, the instructor from the night before, stood nearby, observing quietly. As Tina prepared to step off, Matt gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Take it slow," he said softly, his voice calm. Gabe shot him a glance but said nothing. The water was colder than Tina expected, enveloping her like a heavy blanket. She descended slowly, her breaths loud and deliberate through the regulator. Gabe floated just ahead, motioning for her to follow. Below them, the seafloor came into view, dotted with coral and teeming with life. It was beautiful, stunning even, but Tina's unease refused to fade. They drifted deeper. The sunlight dimmed, the colors muted. The group stayed together, their movements synchronized, a silent choreography. Gabe gestured for Tina to stay close, but his focus seemed elsewhere. She tried to relax, to lose herself in the surreal beauty around her, but the weight of her equipment and the pressure of the water pressed heavily on her chest. A sharp tug at her tank snapped her focus. Tina turned to see Gabe, his gesture sharp and impatient. He pointed to her gauge, indicating she should check her air. Tina fumbled with the controls, her hands trembling. The numbers looked fine, but Gabe's expression was hard to read. Was he annoyed? Concerned? She couldn't tell. As they moved closer to the wreck, Tina felt a sudden, inexplicable resistance in her breathing. It wasn't panic, at least not yet, but something was off. She signaled to Gabe, pointing to her regulator. He paused, looking at her for a moment longer than necessary, then swam closer. His hands moved swiftly, adjusting her gear, his expression calm. "Better?" he signaled. Tina nodded, though the discomfort lingered. Matt appeared nearby, his movements deliberate and fluid. He gave Tina a questioning thumbs up, his eyes scanning her gear. She hesitated, then returned the gesture. Gabe moved between them, blocking Matt's view and motioned for Tina to follow him further down. The wreck loomed ahead, a shadowy silhouette against the sandy seabed. The group stopped briefly to regroup. Tina hovered near the back, her breaths growing heavier. Gabe gestured for her to come closer, but her movements were sluggish. She tried to signal him, but he had already turned away, his attention on something or someone else. Panic began to creep in. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. The vastness of the ocean suddenly felt suffocating. And then it happened. A sudden pull, sharp, jarring, sent her off balance. Tina's regulator slipped momentarily, flooding her mouth with water. She clawed at her mask, trying to regain control. Gabe turned, his expression unreadable, and reached for her. But instead of helping, he paused, his hand hovering as if deciding what to do next. The world blurred. Tina's vision tunneled, the edges darkening. Somewhere nearby, she caught a glimpse of Matt swimming toward her, his movements frantic. The last thing she saw before her body went limp was Gabe's silhouette, floating motionless above her, watching. The dive boat was a hive of activity, divers moving quickly and decisively, yet the tension in the air was unmistakable. Matt broke the surface first, his mask lifted, shouting over the sound of the waves. "She's down there! She's unconscious!" His voice carried a sharp edge, his words cutting through the confusion. Gabe surfaced seconds later, his movements deliberate, almost too measured. His mask stayed in place, obscuring his face. He didn't speak immediately, letting the crew surround Matt instead. A dive instructor shouted, "Get her up! Prepare the oxygen!" The urgency rippled through everyone on board. When Tina's lifeless body was finally brought to the surface, a collective gasp filled the air. Her arms floated limp by her sides, her regulator dangling from her mouth. The instructor worked feverishly to revive her, barking commands to the others. Gabe climbed aboard, removing his mask and sitting at the edge of the boat. His face, calm and composed, betrayed no sign of panic. Instead, he watched the scene unfold, his eyes fixed on Tina with a strange detachment. Matt leaned closer to Tina, his voice trembling as he asked, "What happened? Did she run out of air?" The instructor checked Tina's gear, shaking his head. "Her tank's fine. Pressure levels are normal. This wasn't an equipment failure." The instructor's words hung heavy in the air, sparking uneasy glances among the crew and divers. Gabe finally broke his silence, his voice low but steady. "She panicked. I tried to help, but she kept pulling away. She was sinking too fast." His explanation lacked the desperation one might expect from a grieving husband. Instead, it sounded rehearsed, clinical. Matt, still catching his breath, frowned. "That's not what I saw," he muttered under his breath, but no one responded. The boat sped toward the nearest dock, its engine roaring as waves splashed over the sides. Tina lay on the deck, unmoving, as the crew continued their futile attempts to resuscitate her. Gabe remained apart from the group, his gaze distant. When someone handed him a towel, he accepted it without a word, dabbing his face as if wiping away more than just seawater. At the dock, paramedics awaited their arrival. Tina was quickly transferred to a stretcher, her body covered with a sheet. One of the paramedics glanced at Gabe, who stood motionless near the boat's edge. "Are you her husband?" the man asked. Gabe nodded but offered no further response. His silence was deafening. Matt lingered behind, his fist clenched as he watched the scene unfold. The questions in his mind were relentless. Why had Gabe been so slow to act? Why had he seemed more interested in watching than helping? And why, even now, did he appear so composed? As the paramedics departed, the boat crew gathered in hushed conversations, their voices tinged with unease. One of the divers whispered, "I saw him. He didn't even try to grab her when she was sinking." Another nodded in agreement. The weight of their unspoken doubts began to shift the atmosphere on the boat. The police arrived shortly after, their presence commanding and efficient. Gabe answered their questions with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout. "It was a tragic accident," he repeated. "She wasn't comfortable in the water. I tried my best, but—" His voice trailed off, leaving a gap that no one seemed eager to fill. Matt stepped forward, his voice firm. "I think you should talk to all of us. There are things you need to know." The officer looked at him sharply, taking in the sweat on his brow and the tension in his voice. "We will," the officer replied, his tone measured. "But first, we need to understand the full story." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dock. The first seeds of doubt had already been sown. For Tina's family, who were still unaware of the tragedy, the night ahead would bring unspeakable grief. For Gabe, it marked the beginning of a story he thought he could control, and for Matt, it was the start of a relentless search for answers, answers that even now felt just out of reach. The interrogation room was stark and cold, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows across the table. Gabe sat with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his demeanor calm but guarded. Detective Harris, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for sniffing out inconsistencies, studied him carefully. Gabe had maintained his story. Tina panicked during the dive, and despite his best efforts, she slipped away. "Walk me through it again," Harris said, his voice steady. Gabe leaned back slightly, as if settling into a rehearsed routine. "She panicked. I tried to help, but she wasn't responding to my signals. It all happened so fast." Harris's pen tapped lightly against his notebook. "And you didn't notice anything wrong with her gear before the dive?" Gabe shook his head. "No, everything looked fine. I checked it myself." Across the hall, Matt sat with another officer, his frustration palpable. "I don't buy it," he said, his voice tight. "I saw him adjust her tank underwater. She signaled something was wrong, and he just floated there, like he was waiting for something." The officer frowned. "Are you sure about that?" Matt's expression darkened. "I'm not guessing. I know what I saw." Meanwhile, Harris turned his attention to a file brought in by another detective. Inside were Tina's medical records, her recent Scuba certification, and a curious addition, a copy of her life insurance policy. Harris's eyes narrowed as he read the terms. Just weeks before the wedding, the beneficiary had been changed to Gabe Watson. "Interesting timing," Harris remarked, sliding the document across the table toward Gabe. Gabe's expression barely flickered. "It's standard," he said casually. "We were getting married. It made sense." "Sure," Harris replied, his tone neutral. "But why the rush? Couldn't that have waited until after the honeymoon?" Gabe shrugged. "We were planning for our future. Tina trusted me." Back at the dive center, police interviewed the staff. One technician, a wiry man named Liam, recounted a peculiar moment the day before the dive. "He was insistent about checking her gear himself," Liam said, referring to Gabe. "Most people leave that to us, but he seemed particular." The puzzle pieces were forming, but gaps remained. Divers from the group provided mixed accounts. Most claimed they didn't notice anything unusual until Tina began sinking. But one diver, an older woman named Carol, hesitated when asked about Gabe's behavior. "He wasn't panicked," she said softly. "I've seen people lose loved ones in the water before. There's always that desperation, that fight to do everything you can. But Gabe, he didn't have that." As the hours wore on, Harris pieced together the timeline. Tina's air tank was fully functional, her training adequate for the conditions. There was no mechanical failure, no rogue current, no external factor that could explain her death. Everything pointed back to one variable: Gabe. That evening, Gabe was released temporarily pending further investigation. Reporters swarmed him outside the station, their questions rapid fire. "Mr. Watson, do you have anything to say about your wife's death? Do you deny the allegations that you were negligent? What about the life insurance policy?" Gabe held up his hands, his voice calm but firm. "This was a tragedy. I lost the woman I love, and now people are trying to turn it into something else. I did everything I could to save Tina. That's all I have to say." The crowd buzzed with whispers as he walked away, his face unreadable. Back inside, Harris stood by the window watching the scene unfold. "He's hiding something," he muttered to his partner, "and it's only a matter of time before it slips." In a small motel room across town, Matt sat alone, replaying the dive in his mind. Every movement, every gesture, every second. His gut told him what he couldn't yet prove. Gabe had done something, and whatever it was, Tina had paid the price. Detective Harris sat at his desk, the sound of shuffling papers and the low hum of voices filling the room. The investigation into Tina Watson's death had grown more complex with each passing day, but it was the document in his hands now that sent a chill through him. The life insurance policy. Harris read it carefully, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. A signature dated just 2 weeks before the wedding confirmed the change. Gabe Watson, the sole beneficiary of Tina's substantial policy. 2 weeks, Harris muttered, leaning back in his chair. Right before the wedding. He called for his partner, Detective Miller, who entered the office with a coffee cup in hand. "What's up?" Miller asked, sensing Harris's intensity. Look at this, Harris said, sliding the document across the desk. Miller's eyes scanned the paper, and his expression shifted to one of disbelief. He pushed her to change this. It's right here, plain as day. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy Thomas, Tina's father. Tommy had been cooperative but visibly distraught during previous meetings. Today his demeanor was different. He looked worn but determined, clutching a folder of his own. "Detective, you need to see this," he said, his voice steady but strained. Tommy placed the folder on Harris's desk and opened it. Inside were emails, handwritten notes, and receipts, all pointing to Gabe's insistence on handling Tina's finances. One email stood out, dated a month before the wedding. Gabe had written, "It's just a formality, babe. We need to think about our future, trust me." The phrasing mirrored the comments he had made countless times during the investigation. This wasn't her idea, Tommy said firmly. She didn't even know how much she was worth until Gabe brought it up. Harris nodded, his suspicions aligning with Tommy's revelation. He made sure she trusted him, didn't he? Tommy's face darkened. She believed every word he said. That's the kind of person she was, trusting, loving, and he used that against her. Meanwhile, across town, Gabe was meeting with his lawyer. The media frenzy surrounding Tina's death had grown, with reporters digging into every aspect of the couple's lives. Gabe maintained his calm exterior, but his lawyer wasn't convinced. "Gabe, they're looking into everything now. The insurance, the dive, your past financial troubles. You need to be prepared." "I am," Gabe replied smoothly. "I've told them everything. They have nothing on me." But his confidence faltered when the lawyer mentioned the growing list of witnesses. "This Matt guy," the lawyer said, "he's not backing down. He's telling them you tampered with her gear." Gabe leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "He didn't see anything. He's just trying to play the hero." Back at the station, Harris and Miller examined Tina's financial records, noting several suspicious withdrawals leading up to the wedding. "He was draining her savings," Miller said, shaking his head, setting himself up before he even walked her down the aisle. The detectives pieced together a troubling pattern. Gabe's financial struggles, his push to control Tina's finances, and the life insurance policy all pointed to a calculated plan. Harris rubbed his temples, the weight of the case pressing down on him. "We need more," he said. "This isn't enough for a murder charge. Not yet." That night, Tommy sat alone in his hotel room staring at a photo of Tina. The smile on her face was radiant, full of hope. He clenched the photo tightly, his grief mixing with anger. "I'm going to get him, sweetheart," he whispered. "I promise." Across the room, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Harris. "New lead. Meet us tomorrow morning." The investigation was far from over, but the cracks in Gabe's story were widening. And with each new discovery, the true nature of his actions came closer to the surface. Detective Harris sat hunched over his desk, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off his tired eyes. The deeper he dug into Gabe Watson's past, the more questions surfaced. Financial records painted a troubling picture: unpaid loans, maxed out credit cards, and a pattern of late payments. Gabe had been struggling long before he married Tina, but he had hidden it well. Too well. "Look at this," Harris said, motioning Miller over. 3 separate payday loans within 6 months before the wedding. "And this one?" He pointed to a transaction just days before the ceremony. "A sudden deposit. He was scrambling to keep himself afloat." Miller frowned. "And marrying Tina was his lifeline." Harris nodded. "Exactly. That insurance payout wasn't just a bonus. It was his way out." Across town, Tommy Thomas met with an old friend who worked as a private investigator. He'd had enough of waiting for answers and was determined to uncover the truth. "I need everything you can find on Gabe," Tommy said, sliding over a folder. "Where he worked, who he talked to, anything." The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Lynn, scanned the documents. "You're thinking there's more to this than just the insurance, aren't you?" Tommy's jaw tightened. I know." Meanwhile, Gabe, oblivious to the mounting storm, continued his daily routine. He returned to work at his father's business, acting as though life was slowly returning to normal. But whispers followed him. Neighbors avoided his gaze and colleagues spoke in hushed tones when he passed by. He was no longer just Gabe Watson. He was that guy. At the station, Harris's phone buzzed with a new tip. It was from Liam, the dive center technician. His voice on the other end was shaky but determined. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but I remember Gabe asking to double-check Tina's tank the morning of the dive. He said he just wanted to be sure everything was perfect." Did he touch the regulator? Harris asked, his tone sharp. Liam hesitated. I think so. Yeah, he adjusted something. I didn't think it was weird back then, but now, I don't know. It feels off. Harris scribbled down notes, his pulse quickening. Thanks, Liam. We'll be in touch. Later that evening, Lynn called Tommy with her findings. Gabe's finances were worse than you thought, she said. He wasn't just struggling, he was drowning. And here's the kicker. He looked up life insurance payouts and accidental death benefits on his work computer a month before the wedding. Tommy's grip tightened on the phone. That son of a... He planned this. He planned everything. Back at the station, Harris shared the new evidence with Miller. This guy's not just shady, he's calculating. Every move he made was deliberate, from the insurance change to the dive itself. Miller leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. But deliberate doesn't mean we can prove intent. Not yet. Harris nodded grimly. We need more. The next morning, Harris and Tommy met face to face. Tommy laid out Lynn's findings, his voice steady but filled with rage. This isn't just negligence, it's premeditated. He knew what he was doing. Harris agreed. We're building the case piece by piece, but it has to be airtight. As Tommy left, determination etched into every step. Harris turned back to his board. Photos of Gabe and Tina, timelines and notes filled the space. The truth was coming into focus, but one question still lingered in his mind. How far would someone go to cover their tracks? Far away, Gabe sat in his living room, flipping through channels as if nothing had changed. But his calm exterior belied the storm brewing around him, a storm that was closing in faster than he realized. The knock on Gabe Watson's door echoed through the quiet neighborhood, shattering the stillness of the early evening. He opened it to find Detective Harris and two uniformed officers standing before him, their expressions grim. Harris held up a warrant. Gabe Watson, you are under arrest for the murder of Tina Watson. Gabe froze, his composure faltering for the first time. Murder? He stammered, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. This is a mistake. It was an accident. Harris stepped inside, his tone firm. We've gathered enough evidence to suggest otherwise. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. The officers moved swiftly, handcuffing him as he began to protest. This is insane! You've got it all wrong! Outside, neighbors peeked through windows and curtains, their whispers growing louder. The once quiet street buzzed with speculation as Gabe was led to the waiting patrol car. His face, a mask of shock and defiance, was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights. Back at the station, Gabe sat in an interrogation room, the walls closing in on him. Harris entered with a thick file in hand, dropping it on the table with a deliberate thud. Let's talk about the life insurance policy, Harris began, his voice steady but sharp. Gabe's eyes darted to the file, then back to Harris. It's standard. We were getting married. Couples do this all the time. Right, Harris said, flipping open the file. But most couples don't have a pattern of financial desperation leading up to their wedding. Loans, unpaid debts, and then, miraculously, a new policy that would solve all your problems if one of you happened to die. That's circumstantial, Gabe shot back, his tone defensive. It doesn't prove anything. Harris leaned in, his voice lowering. It proves intent. Combine that with witness statements, your behavior during the dive, and your insistence on controlling Tina's finances. It's a web, Gabe, and you're caught in it. Meanwhile, news of Gabe's arrest spread like wildfire. Headlines blared. Honeymoon tragedy or premeditated murder. Tina's family held a press conference, their grief raw but their resolve unshakable. We just want justice for Tina, Tommy Thomas said, his voice cracking. She deserves so much more than this. The public response was immediate and divided. Social media exploded with opinions. Some called Gabe a monster, while others labeled the arrest a witch hunt. Innocent until proven guilty, one comment read, while another said, you don't change a life insurance policy weeks before a wedding unless you're planning something. Outside the courthouse the next day, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, Justice for Tina and lock him up. Gabe was escorted in by his lawyer, his face stoic but pale. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing relentlessly. Do you maintain your innocence? What do you have to say to Tina's family? Inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out their preliminary case, outlining Gabe's financial motives, suspicious behavior, and the mounting evidence against him. Gabe's defense attorney countered, arguing that the case was built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. But the turning point came when Matt, the dive instructor, took the stand during the bail hearing. His testimony was damning. I saw Gabe adjust her tank underwater, he said firmly. And when she signaled for help, he didn't act. He just watched. Gabe's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The judge denied bail, citing the seriousness of the charges and the risk of flight. Gabe was led away, his head lowered but his jaw clenched. Outside, Tommy stood with Tina's mother, Cindy, their hands tightly clasped. As Gabe was driven away in a prison van, Tommy whispered, "We're one step closer, sweetheart, one step closer." But for the public, the story was far from over. The trial loomed, promising even more revelations and more heartbreak. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension and whispers. Journalists lined the back, their pens poised to capture every word. Tommy Thomas sat in the front row, his hands clenched into fists, his gaze fixed on Gabe Watson. Cindy, beside him, gripped a tissue tightly, her face pale but determined. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to see justice for Tina. Gabe entered with his defense team, his suit crisp, his demeanor calm. To an outsider, he could have been mistaken for a businessman facing a minor dispute, rather than a man accused of orchestrating his wife's death. He avoided eye contact with the spectators, his focus solely on his lawyer. But his confidence seemed almost too perfect, like a mask he had worn many times before. The prosecutor, Sarah Holden, wasted no time in setting the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but forceful, "this case is not about a tragic accident. It is about a man who meticulously planned the death of his wife for financial gain. Gabe Watson stood to benefit from a substantial life insurance payout. He exploited Tina's love and trust, and when the opportunity arose, he took it." The opening statement was followed by a parade of witnesses. Matt, the dive instructor, was among the first to take the stand. His testimony was direct and damning. "I saw him adjust her tank before the dive," Matt said, his voice firm. "Underwater, when Tina signaled for help, he didn't respond. He hesitated, like he was deciding whether to act." Gabe's lawyer, David Bryce, stood to cross-examine, his tone sharp. "Mr. Matt, is it possible that in the chaos of the moment, you misinterpreted what you saw?" Matt didn't waver. "No, I know what I saw." The prosecution then presented forensic evidence. The regulator on Tina's tank showed no signs of mechanical failure. Her oxygen levels were consistent with a functional tank, eliminating the possibility of an equipment malfunction. "There was no reason for Tina to lose control," Holden emphasized, "unless someone made her lose control." On the third day of the trial, the court heard from Liam, the dive center technician. "Gabe was insistent on double-checking her gear that morning," Liam testified. "At the time, I thought he was just being cautious, but now it feels calculated." Tommy's hands tightened on the edge of the bench. Every word reinforced what he had known in his heart since that dreadful day. Gabe had planned it. The defense strategy was equally aggressive. Bryce argued that the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. "Where is the proof?" he demanded during his closing argument. "Where is the definitive evidence that Gabe Watson tampered with Tina's gear or intended to harm her? Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is speculation, an attempt to turn grief into blame." But it was Gabe's own testimony that would leave the courtroom in stunned silence. Taking the stand, he painted a picture of himself as a loving husband, overwhelmed by tragedy. "I loved Tina," he said, his voice cracking at just the right moments. "I would never hurt her. That day, it was the worst day of my life. And now I'm being accused of something I didn't do." The courtroom hung on his every word. To some, his performance was convincing, a man wrongfully accused. To others, it reeked of manipulation. Tommy glared at him, his anger barely contained. "Liar," he muttered under his breath. As the trial stretched into its second week, public interest intensified. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding justice for Tina, while others rallied behind Gabe, claiming the evidence was insufficient. Social media buzzed with debates, every detail dissected and discussed. When closing arguments concluded, the jury retired to deliberate. Hours turned into days, each moment agonizing for Tina's family. Finally, the jury returned, their expressions unreadable. The foreperson stood, her voice steady as she delivered the verdict. "We find the defendant, Gabe Watson, guilty of manslaughter." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Tommy slumped back in his seat, his emotions a mix of relief and frustration. It wasn't the murder conviction they had hoped for, but it was something, a step toward justice. As Gabe was led away, his calm facade cracked for a brief moment, his eyes darting toward the spectators. For the first time, he looked afraid. The courtroom was silent as the judge returned to his seat, the weight of the verdict hanging heavily in the air. Gabe Watson stood at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his expression unreadable. Across the room, Tina's parents, Tommy and Cindy Thomas, held their breath, clinging to the hope that justice would be served. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady as he began to speak. The jury has found the defendant, Gabe Watson, guilty of manslaughter. The sentence is 4.5 years in prison, reduced to 18 months with time served. Gasps filled the room. Cindy let out an audible sob, her face buried in her hands while Tommy's jaw clenched tightly, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the bench. The words 18 months echoed in his mind like a cruel joke. Gabe remained motionless, his demeanor calm, as though he had expected this outcome all along. His lawyer leaned over, whispering something in his ear, but Gabe barely reacted. To the spectators, his stoicism came off as chilling, almost smug. The judge continued, his tone firm but resigned. While the evidence suggests negligence and recklessness, there is insufficient proof beyond a reasonable doubt to establish premeditated murder. Therefore, this court must adhere to the limits of the law. For Tina's family, it felt like a slap in the face. As the judge left the bench, Cindy turned to Tommy, her voice trembling. "How is this justice? He took our daughter from us and he gets to walk free in less than 2 years?" Tommy's eyes never left Gabe, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. "It's not over," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Protesters who had gathered in support of Tina's family erupted in anger, their chants of justice for Tina growing louder. Reporters swarmed the steps, their microphones thrust forward as they shouted questions at anyone willing to answer. Gabe was escorted out a side entrance, shielded from the chaos by security. Cameras captured his every move, his face stoic as ever. But for a fleeting moment as he climbed into the waiting car, there was a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or guilt. It vanished just as quickly as it appeared. In the days that followed, the verdict dominated headlines. News outlets debated the fairness of the sentence, with legal analysts dissecting the nuances of the case. 18 months for a life lost. Is this justice or a failure of the system? One anchor questioned during a primetime segment. Social media was ablaze with outrage. Comments flooded in from around the world, with hashtags like #JusticeForTina and #UnfairVerdict trending globally. "He gets a slap on the wrist while her family gets a lifetime of grief," one user wrote. Others pointed out the limitations of the evidence, arguing that the court had no choice but to rule as it did. For Tommy and Cindy, the media frenzy offered little comfort. Each headline, each interview was a painful reminder of the daughter they had lost. In their quiet moments, the weight of Tina's absence felt almost unbearable. But their resolve to fight on remained unshaken. One evening, as Tommy sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents and clippings, his phone buzzed. It was a message from their private investigator, Lynn. The text was brief but promising. "Found something, call me." The next morning, Tommy and Cindy met with Lynn, who laid out her findings. "There's more to Gabe's financial situation than we initially thought," she began. "I found records indicating he had been exploring other insurance policies, including one he tried to take out on Tina without her knowledge." Tommy's fists tightened as his suspicions were confirmed. "This isn't negligence," he said through gritted teeth. "This is calculated." Lynn nodded. "The problem is getting the evidence admitted. Double jeopardy laws are going to make it nearly impossible to reopen the case." But Tommy wasn't deterred. "Then we go public," he said firmly. "If the law won't hold him accountable, we'll make sure the world knows who he really is." As the Thomases prepared for their next battle, Gabe adjusted to life in prison. Though his sentence was short, the walls around him began to close in. Letters from strangers poured in, some supporting him, others condemning him. The weight of his actions, once so easily dismissed, now felt inescapable. And somewhere deep down, Gabe knew this was far from over. The gates of the prison creaked open, and Gabe Watson stepped out into the glaring sunlight. The weight of 18 months behind bars was etched into his face, though his expression remained stoic. Waiting for him was his father, standing beside a sleek black car. Gabe nodded in acknowledgement, his movements brisk as he climbed into the passenger seat. As the car pulled away, whispers and camera shutters followed in its wake. Reporters stood at a distance, their lenses capturing every second of his release. The world's eyes were still on him, but for Gabe, freedom felt muted. The prison walls might have been left behind, but the shadow of Tina's death loomed larger than ever. Back in Birmingham, the Thomases watched the news coverage in silence. Tommy's jaw tightened as the reporter spoke. Gabe Watson, the man convicted of manslaughter in the death of his wife Tina Watson during their honeymoon dive, has been released after serving his reduced sentence. Cindy turned to Tommy, her voice trembling. How can they let him walk free? It feels like she's been forgotten. She hasn't, Tommy replied, his voice firm. We won't let her be. Meanwhile, Gabe returned to his parents' home, a sprawling house in a quiet neighborhood. It was meant to be a refuge, but even there the unease was palpable. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their glances sharp and accusatory whenever he ventured outside. One morning, Gabe stepped onto the porch to retrieve the newspaper, only to find an envelope addressed to him in bold block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a chilling message. We know what you did. His hands trembled as he crumpled the note, scanning the empty street for signs of who might have delivered it. But there was no one, just the stillness of the morning air and the weight of his own conscience. Public opinion remained divided. Online forums buzzed with debates, some defending Gabe, others condemning him. He served his time. Leave him alone, one user wrote. Another countered, 18 months for a life? That's not justice. For Tina's family, the fight was far from over. Tommy and Cindy began working with advocacy groups, using their platform to push for legal reforms that would ensure stricter penalties for crimes like Gabe's. This isn't just about Tina anymore, Tommy said during an interview. It's about making sure no other family has to go through this. But privately, the Thomases were struggling. Late one night, Tommy found Cindy sitting alone in the living room clutching a photo of Tina. I just want her back, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Tommy knelt beside her, his voice breaking. I know, Cindy. I know. But we have to keep going. For her. For Gabe, the days blurred together in a haze of isolation. He avoided public places, knowing the stares and whispers would follow him. Every knock at the door sent his heart racing. Every unfamiliar car parked on the street set his nerves on edge. One afternoon, Gabe's lawyer visited, his tone brisk. We need to talk, he said, dropping a file onto the table. There's more noise about your case. Tina's family isn't letting this go. They're pushing for a public inquiry. Gabe's composure cracked for a moment, his voice rising. I've done my time. What more do they want? They want answers, the lawyer replied coolly, and they're not going to stop until they get them. As the lawyer left, Gabe sat alone at the table, his thoughts spiraling. The walls of the house seemed to close in on him, the silence suffocating. He glanced at the crumpled note in the trash, the words, "We know what you did," burning in his mind. Far from Birmingham in a quiet cemetery, Tommy and Cindy visited Tina's grave. The air was heavy with unspoken words as they stood in the fading light. We're not done, Tina, Tommy said softly. Not by a long shot. And somewhere in the shadows, the truth about what happened beneath the waves refused to stay buried. The room was dimly lit, filled with the faint hum of a recording device. Detective Harris sat across from Lynn, Tommy's private investigator, who had brought him something unexpected, a voice from the past. It's an old recording, Lynn said, sliding a small tape recorder across the table. From someone who knew Gabe before Tina. Harris pressed play, and the room filled with a tinny voice, male, cautious, but firm. I worked with Gabe years ago, the voice began. He wasn't the guy everyone thought he was. He always had a way of manipulating people, especially women. There was this one girl he dated before Tina. She told me once that Gabe pressured her to take out an insurance policy too, said it was for their future. She didn't go through with it. Lucky for her. The detective leaned back, his mind racing. Why wasn't this brought up before? She was scared, Lynn replied. And she moved overseas not long after, but when she heard about Tina, she wanted to speak out, anonymously. Across town, Tommy and Cindy sat in their living room, sifting through letters and emails from people claiming to know something about Gabe. Most were vague, but a few stood out. One letter in particular caught Cindy's attention. It was from a woman named Rachel, who claimed to have dated Gabe years ago. He was controlling, Rachel wrote. Always wanted things his way. When I tried to leave, he said I'd regret it. Tommy read the letter aloud, his voice shaking. He's been like this for years, he said, anger simmering beneath his words. This wasn't a one-time thing. The Thomases reached out to Rachel, who agreed to speak to them on the condition of privacy. Meeting in a quiet cafe, Rachel recounted her story. Gabe had a way of making you feel like everything he did was for you, she said, her voice steady but bitter. But it was always about control. And when you pushed back, he'd get Cold. Calculated. Rachel described how Gabe had pressured her into signing legal documents she barely understood, including a proposal for an insurance policy. I didn't think much of it at the time, she admitted. But now, looking back, it's clear what he was doing. Meanwhile, Harris pieced together a timeline of Gabe's relationships, financial troubles, and manipulative tactics. Patterns emerged. Each woman he dated seemed to have something he could gain from, whether it was financial stability or social connections. Tina, with her trusting nature and sizable life insurance policy, had been his ultimate target. The revelations reignited media interest. News outlets began running exposés on Gabe's past, featuring interviews with former acquaintances and diving experts who questioned his actions during the fatal dive. Public opinion, once divided, began to shift overwhelmingly against him. Gabe, now living under a cloud of suspicion, found himself increasingly isolated. His neighbors avoided him, his family grew distant, and his attempts to re-enter normal life were met with resistance. One afternoon, he discovered graffiti sprayed across his driveway, "Murderer." For Tina's family, the new information was both validating and heartbreaking. "It confirms what we've known all along," Tommy said during a press interview. "Gabe didn't just take our daughter's life. He planned it, and he's done it before." Harris worked tirelessly to compile enough evidence to reopen the case, but the double jeopardy laws presented a formidable barrier. "We need something irrefutable," he told Lynn, "a smoking gun." The Thomases continued their advocacy, using every platform available to share Tina's story. At a public rally, Cindy addressed the crowd, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We won't stop until there's justice for Tina. She deserves so much more than this." As the rally concluded, Tommy received a call from Harris. "We might have something," the detective said, his tone cautious but hopeful. "It's not enough for a conviction yet, but it's a start." Far away, Gabe sat alone in his darkened living room, the walls closing in around him. The voices of his past, once buried, were now rising to the surface, and with them came the inescapable weight of the truth. Tommy Thomas stood on the courthouse steps, staring at the imposing stone facade as the crowd behind him grew restless. Reporters called his name, their microphones thrust forward, their cameras focused on his grief-stricken face. Cindy stood beside him, clutching his arm, her expression resolute despite the weariness in her eyes. They had just come from yet another meeting with the legal counsel, another reminder that the system wasn't built for families like theirs, families seeking justice for lives stolen by manipulation and greed. "Double jeopardy laws are ironclad," the attorney had said, his voice heavy with regret. "Without new evidence, evidence that directly proves intent, there's no way to reopen the case." The words echoed in Tommy's mind as he faced the press. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within. "We came here today to ask for justice," he began. "Not just for Tina, but for every family who has faced what we have. The law has failed us, and we won't stop until something changes." Behind him, the crowd erupted into applause and chants of "Justice for Tina." It was a powerful moment, but Tommy couldn't shake the feeling of futility. They were up against an immovable force, a legal system that prioritized procedure over people. Inside the courthouse, Detective Harris watched the scene unfold from a window. He felt a pang of frustration, knowing the Thomases deserved more. But the evidence he'd collected, while damning in the court of public opinion, wasn't enough to override the legal protections Gabe Watson now enjoyed. Still, Harris couldn't bring himself to let go of the case. There had to be a way. Meanwhile, Gabe tried to resume his life in quiet obscurity, but the world wouldn't let him forget. Protesters gathered outside his home, their chants relentless. "Murderer! Murderer!" Spray painted across his garage door greeted him one morning. He stayed inside most days, blinds drawn, phone off, but even in isolation, he couldn't escape the whispers or his own thoughts. One afternoon, a letter arrived in Gabe's mailbox. There was no return address, just a single sentence typed neatly on plain paper. "You'll never be free." He crumpled the paper in his hand, his calm facade cracking. He wasn't free. He was trapped in the shadow of his actions, hunted by the truth that refused to stay buried. For the Thomases, the fight took a new direction. They partnered with advocacy groups, launching a campaign to reform double jeopardy laws. They shared Tina's story at rallies, on television, and across social media. The hashtag #JusticeForTina gained traction, sparking debates about the balance between legal protections and moral accountability. But the toll on their personal lives was immense. Late one night, Tommy found Cindy sitting alone in Tina's old room, her eyes fixed on a photo of their daughter. "I don't know how much more I can do, Tommy," she whispered. "Every time we tell her story, it's like losing her all over again." Tommy knelt beside her, his voice soft but determined. "We're doing this for her, Cindy, so she's not just another victim, so people remember who she was." The next morning, the Thomases received a call from Harris. "I found something," he said cautiously. "It's not enough for a conviction yet, but it's significant. Can you come in?" Hope flickered in Tommy's chest as they drove to the station, but it was tempered by the weight of past disappointments. Harris met them in his office, spreading out documents across his desk. "It's circumstantial," he admitted, "but it's another piece of the puzzle." The documents detailed Gabe's continued financial troubles, including attempts to take out a second insurance policy on Tina before their wedding. It wasn't the smoking gun they needed, but it painted an increasingly damning picture. "Is this enough to push for an inquiry?" Tommy asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Harris shook his head. "Not yet, but it adds pressure." As the Thomases left, their determination renewed, Gabe sat alone in his darkened living room, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Justice for Tina remained elusive, but the fight was far from over, and deep down Gabe knew his reprieve was only temporary. The crowd in the auditorium sat in hushed anticipation as Cindy Thomas stepped up to the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. The room was packed, students, reporters, and advocates eager to hear her speak. Behind her, a large screen displayed a photo of Tina, her radiant smile frozen in time. "Thank you all for being here," Cindy began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Tina was more than a victim. She was our daughter, our friend, and someone who believed in love and trust. And those qualities, they were used against her." The audience remained silent, captivated by her words. Cindy recounted Tina's life, not just the tragedy but her joy, her dreams, and the person she was before Gabe entered her life. "We tell Tina's story not to dwell on the past but to change the future," she said, her voice growing firmer, "to ensure that no other family endures what we have." Tommy sat in the front row, his hands folded tightly, his gaze unwavering. He had given speeches like this before, but tonight felt different. The momentum of their fight had grown. Their voices were no longer isolated. Advocacy groups were now calling for a national conversation on reforming double jeopardy laws and addressing gaps in the justice system. Yet for Tommy, every step forward felt overshadowed by the unanswered questions that still haunted him. Later that evening, back at their home, Tommy and Cindy sorted through emails from supporters and tips from strangers. One email stood out. It was from a diver who had been on the same boat as Tina and Gabe that fateful day. "I didn't think my story would matter," the message read, "but after seeing your interviews, I feel like I need to come forward." The Thomases immediately forwarded the email to Detective Harris, who set up a meeting with the diver. During the conversation, the man revealed details that had never been mentioned in court. "I remember Gabe adjusting Tina's tank before the dive," he said. "At the time, it didn't seem unusual, but now I can't stop thinking about how deliberate he was." Harris took notes carefully, his mind racing. The diver's account aligned with other testimonies, creating a clearer picture of what might have happened underwater. "It's another piece of the puzzle," Harris told Tommy later, "but it still might not be enough to reopen the case." Meanwhile, Gabe's life continued to unravel. Isolated and paranoid, he avoided public places entirely. Anonymous threats arrived weekly, emails, letters, even graffiti scrawled across his fence. The words, "We know what you did," haunted him, appearing over and over like a mantra he couldn't escape. One day, Gabe received a package on his doorstep. Inside was a collection of clippings and handwritten notes, all detailing Tina's story. At the bottom was a chilling message: "The truth will find you." He slammed the box shut, his hands shaking. For the first time, Gabe felt the weight of his lies pressing down, threatening to crush him. As the Thomases pushed forward, they continued to reflect on the legacy of Tina's life. During a televised interview, Tommy was asked what justice would look like for their family. He paused, his voice heavy with grief. "Justice," he said finally, "is knowing the truth and making sure no one else suffers because of it." But behind the scenes, the pain of Tina's loss remained sharp. Cindy admitted to Tommy one night, "Even if the truth comes out, it won't bring her back." "No," Tommy agreed, his voice breaking, "but it might stop someone else like him." The interview and their tireless advocacy began to gain traction. A senator reached out, offering to sponsor a bill addressing the gaps in double jeopardy laws. It's a long shot, the senator admitted, but it's worth pursuing. For the Thomases, it was a glimmer of hope. But the questions surrounding Tina's death still lingered. What truly happened in those final moments underwater? Could justice ever fully be achieved? And most hauntingly, how many others had fallen victim to the same darkness that took their daughter? As they prepared for another rally, Tommy looked at Cindy and whispered, "We'll never stop, will we?" "No," she replied, her voice firm. "Not until everyone knows who Gabe really is." The cemetery was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Tommy Thomas stood at Tina's grave, the familiar ache in his chest growing sharper with each visit. In his hand, he held a bouquet of lilies, Tina's favorite. Cindy stood beside him, silent, her fingers brushing against the headstone as if trying to connect with their daughter one more time. "We've come so far, Tina," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling, "but it still doesn't feel like enough." The past months had been a whirlwind of rallies, interviews, and meetings with lawmakers. The proposed reforms to double jeopardy laws were gaining traction, but the process was slow, agonizingly slow. Every step forward felt like a battle against an unyielding tide, and Tommy often wondered how much more they could endure. Cindy finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "She'd be proud of us, Tommy, of everything we've done." He nodded, but the weight of unresolved questions lingered. "I just wish we had the whole truth, every piece of it." Meanwhile, Gabe Watson sat in his darkened living room, the curtains drawn tight against the outside world. The constant whispers and accusations had worn him down, leaving him a shadow of the man he once was. A knock at the door startled him, his heart racing as he stood frozen. When he finally opened it, there was no one there, just an envelope lying on the porch. Inside was a single photograph, Tina, smiling brightly on her wedding day. Scrawled across the bottom were the words, "You can't escape the past." Gabe slammed the door shut, his hands shaking. The pressure of his lies and the weight of the public scorn had turned his life into a prison of its own making. He knew that no matter where he went, the truth would follow him, a specter he could never outrun. At the Thomas household, Tommy and Cindy were preparing for another rally when Detective Harris called. "I have something," he said, his tone cautious. A new witness came forward, another diver. They saw something that might tip the scales. The hope in Tommy's chest flickered to life, but he forced himself to remain measured. "Is it enough to reopen the case?" Harris sighed. "Not yet, but it strengthens the narrative. We're closer than we've ever been." The rally that evening was the largest yet. Hundreds gathered with signs and candles, their voices united in a call for justice. Tommy took the stage, his voice breaking as he spoke. "This isn't just about Tina. It's about making sure the system works for all of us, for every victim, for every family left behind. We won't stop until the truth is known." The crowd erupted in applause, their chants of "Justice for Tina" echoing into the night. Yet as Tommy stepped off the stage, he couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. Later that night, as the Thomases sat together in their living room, Cindy reached for Tommy's hand. "Do you think we'll ever get closure?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with both determination and sorrow. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know we'll never stop trying." Far away in the shadows of his empty home, Gabe stared at the photograph on his coffee table. The words scrawled across it seemed to burn into his mind. "You can't escape the past." He knew they were true. No matter how much he tried to bury the truth, it would always resurface, like a tide that couldn't be held back. And so, the story remained unfinished. For the Thomases, for Gabe, and for everyone who followed Tina's case, the questions lingered. Would the truth ever fully come to light? Would justice ever truly be served? Or would Tina's legacy forever be one of unanswered questions? As the first rays of dawn broke through the night, one thing was certain: the fight wasn't over. And for those who loved Tina, it never would be. What do you think of Gabe Watson and his actions? Was justice truly served? Or does this case highlight a deeper flaw in the system? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping true crime content, don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on our latest investigations. See you in the next story.